A black woman was boarding her flight, ready for a quiet journey. But the events that followed shocked everyone on board. A flight crew member targeted her, questioning her every move and fixating on her sleek, locked briefcase. The whispers started, assumptions were made, and then the unthinkable happened. Police were called as soon as the plane landed. In front of a crowd of curious and judgmental eyes, she was escorted off the plane and into a private room. But what the officers found inside her briefcase changed everything. The truth about her identity not only silenced the room but ignited a conversation no one could ignore. Stay with me, this is a story you need to hear. Before we begin, comment below where you're watching from. And if this story inspires you, don't forget to subscribe for more moments that matter. Victoria Hayes moved through Pearson International Airport with the precision of someone who had mastered the art of invisibility in plain sight. Her silver hair, neatly swept back, shimmered under the fluorescent lights. A tailored navy blazer draped over her shoulders, paired with slacks that whispered authority. In her left hand, she carried a sleek metallic briefcase, its reflective surface catching the curious eyes of passers-by. For Victoria, the briefcase was more than a carrier for documents and accolades, it was a symbol. Nestled inside was a medal that spoke of a lifetime of service, perseverance, and an unyielding commitment to justice. Yet, as she walked through the bustling terminal, the weight she carried was not just the contents of the briefcase but the unspoken assumptions that followed her every step. The murmurs began as she approached the security line, subtle but persistent. A glance here, a whispered word there, the kind of chatter that masked itself in politeness but carried the sharp edge of suspicion. Victoria had been here before, in airports, in boardrooms, and on city streets. The same questions always lingered, unspoken but understood. What is she doing here? Why does she look like that and carry herself like this? At the security checkpoint, the first challenge presented itself. A young agent, no older than her grandson, scrutinized her identification with unnecessary thoroughness. His eyes darted between her and the laminated card, searching for anything that might validate his unease. Purpose of travel, ma'am? He asked, his tone neutral but his gaze skeptical. Business, Victoria replied, her voice measured, refusing to let irritation seep into her words. I'm delivering a keynote in Washington. The agent hesitated, his fingers drumming on the counter before finally nodding her through. It wasn't the words that bothered him, Victoria realized, but the confidence behind them. Women like her weren't supposed to move through the world with such certainty, or so he believed. As she walked away, she felt the first prickle of tension along her spine. It wasn't anger, not exactly. It was the weight of knowing that, despite decades of breaking barriers, some barriers refused to fall. At the boarding gate, the atmosphere shifted again. Victoria stepped into the line reserved for first-class passengers, her boarding pass in hand. The gate agent, a woman with a crisp uniform and a practiced smile, greeted her with the kind of professionalism that barely masked discomfort. "Good evening, ma'am," the agent said, her eyes flicking to the briefcase. "May I see your boarding pass?" Victoria handed it over without a word. The agent studied it for a beat too long, her smile faltering ever so slightly before she handed it back. "Enjoy your flight," she said, but the words hung heavy with something unspoken. Victoria nodded and moved on. The plane's cabin was a cocoon of subdued luxury. Soft leather seats, ambient lighting, and the faint hum of engines offered a temporary reprieve from the chaos outside. Victoria stowed her briefcase in the overhead compartment, her movements deliberate, almost ceremonial. The metallic click of the latch echoed in the quiet space, drawing the attention of a flight attendant. "Can I help you with that?" the attendant asked. Her smile tight and her eyes locked on the briefcase. "No, thank you," Victoria replied, her tone polite but firm. She took her seat and opened a leather-bound notebook, the pages filled with handwritten notes for her speech. But she could feel the flight attendant's presence linger, her curiosity simmering just beneath the surface. As the other passengers boarded, Victoria let her pen hover over the paper, her mind drifting. The murmurs, the glances, the hesitations, they were not new, but they were relentless. Each moment was a small test, an unspoken challenge to her dignity. She had learned to navigate them with grace, but the effort left a residue, a quiet exhaustion that clung to her at the end of each day. The plane began to fill, and Victoria allowed herself a moment of reprieve. She closed her eyes, inhaling deeply, letting the hum of the engines steady her thoughts. But even in rest, her mind remained alert, attuned to the rhythms of a world that often questioned her place within it. In the galley, the flight attendant whispered to a colleague. Their words were too quiet to hear. But Victoria didn't need to. The sidelong glances in her direction, the furtive gestures toward the briefcase, they told her all she needed to know. She opened her eyes and returned to her notebook. The words flowed easily, but her thoughts were elsewhere, tracing the fault lines of a society where such moments were still possible. She wasn't angry, not yet. Anger was a fire she reserved for battles worth fighting. This was something smaller, quieter, but no less insidious, a reminder that, even here, in a space she had rightfully earned, she was still a question mark in the minds of those around her. For now, she wrote. For now, she waited. But Victoria Hayes knew this flight would not pass without incident. It never did. The hum of the engines had settled into a steady rhythm, a sound that for most passengers meant the flight was progressing smoothly. Victoria Hayes, seated in 2A, adjusted her posture against the cool leather seat and tried to immerse herself in the notes before her. She had written these words a dozen times already, but the cadence and delivery still mattered. This was no ordinary speech. It was a declaration, a lifetime of service distilled into a single moment. Yet, she could not ignore the tension gathering like storm clouds in the cabin. It was subtle at first, an undercurrent rather than a tempest. The flight attendant, Ellen Fisher, moved with the practiced efficiency of her profession, but her gaze returned to Victoria's seat too often to be accidental. Her motions were brisk, her fixed smile faltering when she thought no one was watching. Victoria had lived long enough to recognize such behavior. She had seen it in the way cashiers double-checked her payments, the way store clerks helped her while keeping her under watchful eyes. It was the quiet suspicion that cloaked itself in manners, a soft-spoken doubt that refused to announce itself outright but lingered like a shadow nonetheless. Across the aisle, a businessman adjusted his tie, his eyes skimming over Victoria without acknowledgement, as though her existence was too foreign to register. To his right, a young woman whispered into her partner's ear, their laughter soft but pointed. Victoria's gaze didn't waver, her expression a mask of composure. She had perfected this stillness, a response born of necessity. Ellen paused at the galley, her fingers toying with a coffee stir stick as she leaned toward a colleague. "She's so guarded," Ellen murmured, her words barely audible over the low hum of the cabin. Mark Reynolds, a younger attendant busy sorting napkins, didn't look up. "She's a first-class passenger." "Ellen, they're all guarded. It's part of the territory." "It's not just that," Ellen pressed, her voice tinged with something sharper. "Did you see how she locked that briefcase? Like it's the crown jewels or something." Mark sighed and turned to face her, his expression weary. "And people bring all kinds of stuff into first class. Maybe it is valuable. Doesn't mean it's suspicious." But Ellen's unease didn't dissipate. She cast another glance toward Victoria, her brows knitting together. "I don't know, Mark. It just doesn't feel right." Victoria didn't have to hear the words to know the shape of the conversation. She could feel it in the way Ellen's gaze lingered too long, in the way whispers stopped just as she turned her head. It was a script she had read countless times before, its lines familiar even when delivered by new actors. A young boy shuffled down the aisle, his small hand clutching a worn teddy bear. As he passed, his mother's hand tightened on his shoulder, and her gaze flicked toward Victoria with a faintly apologetic smile, a silent assurance that her child wouldn't disturb the important woman. It was a brief, human moment, but even it carried the weight of expectation. Victoria glanced down at her notebook. The pages blurred as her thoughts wandered. The speech she was preparing wasn't just about her career or the accolades that had followed it. It was about dismantling the structures that made moments like this so common, so ordinary. And yet here she was, in the thick of the very struggle she sought to address. Ellen, unable to quell her unease, approached the cockpit. Her knock was soft but insistent. The co-pilot, a man with tired eyes and an equally tired demeanor, opened the door partway, his headset hanging loose around his neck. "What is it?" he asked, his tone edged with irritation. "It's the woman in 2A. Ellen began, her voice lowering as she leaned closer. "She's got this briefcase sleek, locked, expensive looking. She's acting unusual. I think we should report it." The co-pilot frowned, glancing toward the cabin as if trying to pick out Victoria from a distance. Unusual how? Ellen hesitated, her words faltering under his scrutiny. I don't know, guarded. She doesn't engage with anyone. And the way she carries herself, it's just different. The co-pilot sighed, leaning against the doorframe. Different isn't a reason to call security. Ellen, if there's no immediate threat, we leave it alone. If you're still concerned, file something after we land. Until then, drop it. But, drop it, he repeated, his voice firm, before closing the door with a click that echoed louder than it should have. Ellen returned to the galley, her frustration simmering. She exchanged a glance with Mark, who simply shook his head, a silent plea for her to let it go. But Ellen couldn't. Her gaze returned to Victoria, whose calm demeanor now seemed almost defiant, as though she knew she was being watched and refused to let it unsettle her. Victoria, for her part, didn't flinch. Years of navigating these waters had taught her that stillness was often the best armor. But as the plane settled into its cruising altitude, she couldn't help but wonder, when would the whispers turn into actions? And what would it cost her to navigate this latest storm? The tension in the cabin thickened, not loud enough to be named but palpable to anyone willing to look closely. For the passengers around her, this was just another flight, another routine journey. For Victoria Hayes, it was another reminder that even here, in a space she had rightfully earned, the shadows of doubt and prejudice followed her still. As the engines hummed on, she leaned back in her seat and allowed her eyes to close. But her mind didn't rest. It never did. It stayed sharp, waiting, knowing the true turbulence was yet to come. The flight had leveled off, and a quiet settled over the cabin. For most passengers, it was the cue to loosen their belts, recline their seats, and escape into books, movies, or half-forgotten dreams. But for Victoria Hayes, the silence carried a weight that could not be ignored. It pressed against her like the recycled air in the cabin, thick and inescapable. She opened her eyes and adjusted the angle of her notebook, pretending to write while keeping her peripheral vision attuned to the galley. Ellen Fisher was there again, her movements hurried, her posture taut. Ellen's whispers to Mark had grown more urgent, her glances toward Victoria sharper, more pointed. She's too calm, Ellen murmured, her tone low but sharp enough to slice through the hum of the engines. Have you ever seen anyone act so composed? It's like she's hiding something. Mark sighed, exasperated. Ellen, you're imagining things. Let it go. We've got service to prep. But Ellen didn't let it go. She leaned closer to Mark, her voice dropping further. It's not just her attitude. It's that briefcase. Why lock it like that unless you've got something to hide? And did you notice how she barely reacts to anything? Like she's planning. Victoria didn't need to hear the words to know what was being said. It was always the same script, rehearsed and reinterpreted across decades, across generations. The language of suspicion rarely changed. Even when the actors did, she kept her pen moving across the page, though she wrote nothing of substance. The scratch of ink on paper masking the sound of her quickened breath. Ellen finally made her decision. She left the galley and approached Victoria's row, her smile forced and too bright. Excuse me, ma'am, Ellen began, her tone polite but clipped, like a blade wrapped in silk. Can I offer you a drink? Perhaps some water or coffee? Victoria looked up, her eyes steady, her expression unreadable. No, thank you, she said, her voice calm. But Ellen lingered, her gaze flicked to the overhead compartment, where the briefcase rested. You know, it's not always safe to stow valuable items up there. Things can shift during turbulence. Victoria tilted her head slightly, catching the implication like a whiff of smoke before a fire. It's secure, she replied. Her tone was polite but firm, carrying just enough weight to suggest the conversation should end there. Yet Ellen didn't move. Are you sure there isn't anything I can help with? Her eyes darted briefly to Victoria's hands, to the notebook, then back to her face. I'm sure, Victoria said, the steel in her voice unmistakable now. Ellen hesitated, the silence between them taut and uncomfortable, before she finally nodded and stepped away. Victoria watched her retreat to the galley, her back stiff with frustration. This wasn't the end of it, she knew that much. Across the aisle, a man coughed into his hand, his eyes cutting sideways toward Victoria. A middle-aged woman one row behind shifted in her seat, her whispers to her traveling companion just loud enough to reach Victoria's ears. She's acting so strange. The woman muttered. Who sits that still for this long? Her companion murmured something in response. But the tone was unmistakable. Agreement. Victoria exhaled slowly, her fingers tightening around the pen. It wasn't the words that stung, it was their familiarity. How many times had she been reduced to a collection of oddities? Her behavior dissected for faults that weren't there? To some, her dignity was a mask, her silence a weapon, her confidence an affront. It was exhausting. But exhaustion wasn't a luxury Victoria could afford. She straightened in her seat, brushing invisible dust from her blazer, and resumed her writing. To anyone watching, she appeared calm, composed, perhaps even detached. Inside, her mind churned, calculating the ways this would escalate. Because it always did. Back in the galley, Ellen made her way to the cockpit, her hands clenched tightly by her sides. When the co-pilot opened the door, his expression was wary, his patience already worn thin. Again? He asked. His voice clipped. Yes, again, Ellen replied, her voice lowered but insistent. Look, I know you said to let it go. But something about her doesn't sit right. That briefcase, it's locked. What if there's something dangerous inside? The co-pilot pinched the bridge of his nose, his frustration mounting. Ellen, do you have any actual reason to believe this passenger is a threat? Or are you just... I'm not imagining this. Ellen interrupted, her voice rising slightly. I'm telling you, there's something off about her. We need to call this in. The co-pilot's shoulders sagged as he let out a long, exasperated breath. Fine, he said finally. I'll notify security at the gate. But don't say another word to her. And don't make a scene. Understood? Ellen nodded, her expression triumphant, as though she'd just won a hard-fought battle. She returned to the galley. But the satisfaction didn't last long. Ellen kept stealing glances at Victoria, her unease growing rather than dissipating. Victoria, for her part, remained still. The air around her felt heavier now, charged with tension that crackled just beneath the surface. She could feel the eyes on her, the weight of assumptions pressing against her like an invisible force. This was no longer about her briefcase or her demeanor. It was about something much larger, something that had followed her through every phase of her life. The plane cut through the clouds, its steady motion belying the turbulence brewing inside the cabin. Victoria didn't look up, didn't acknowledge the whispers or the glances. But inside, she braced herself. She knew the storm was far from over. It never was. The plane had begun its slow descent, the shift in altitude making ears pop and bringing with it the ritual of preparation. Seatbacks were straightened, tray tables folded away, and overhead compartments checked for loose items. For most passengers, it was the prelude to landing, a time to gather belongings and thoughts. The journey nearing its end. For Victoria Hayes, it was something else entirely. It was the calm before the inevitable storm. The intercom crackled. Ladies and gentlemen, we ask that you remain seated after we land as we handle a minor security matter. Thank you for your cooperation. The words hung in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Heads turned in confusion, and a ripple of unease spread through the cabin. Victoria's heart didn't race, it rarely did anymore. Instead, it steadied itself, her breathing measured, her posture impeccable. She had learned to expect these moments, to prepare for them without truly being prepared. The plane touched down with a gentle jolt, its wheels meeting the runway with a precision that belied the chaos brewing inside. From her window seat, Victoria could see the flashing lights of police vehicles waiting at the gate. Red and blue danced across the darkened tarmac, a spectacle that seemed both surreal and inevitable. Security matter? A voice murmured behind her. I wonder what that's about. Probably someone dangerous, came the hushed reply, heavy with implication. Victoria heard it all without turning her head, without giving them the satisfaction of acknowledgement. Instead, she adjusted her blazer and reached for her briefcase. Her movements deliberate and calm. Her resolve had been tested too many times to falter now. The cabin door opened, and the sound of boots echoed against the jet bridge. 2 uniformed officers entered, their presence commanding and immediate. One of them, a tall man with a clipped voice, addressed the cabin. Passenger in seat 2A. Please remain seated. Everyone else, stay in your seats until instructed to disembark. Every head turned toward her. Some passengers whispered, others simply stared. To them, she was no longer the composed woman in the tailored blazer. She was a question mark, a mystery to be unraveled. And the officers at the front of the plane had just confirmed their suspicions. Victoria sat still, her hands resting lightly on the armrests. She met the officer's gaze when he approached, her expression calm but unyielding. "Ma'am, we need you to step off the plane with us," he said, his tone neutral but firm. "May I ask why?" Victoria replied, her voice steady, each word chosen with care. "It's a routine matter," the officer said, evading her question. "We'll explain everything once we're off the plane." Routine. The word stung, not for its meaning but for its history. Routine was the euphemism that cloaked so many indignities. The word that turned suspicion into policy, prejudice into procedure. Victoria rose from her seat, her movements measured. She retrieved her briefcase from the overhead compartment, its metallic sheen catching the light. As she walked down the aisle, the whispers grew louder, the passenger's curiosity turning into quiet judgment. A child asked loudly, "Mom, what did she do?" The mother hushed him, her cheeks coloring with embarrassment. At the front of the cabin, Victoria caught a glimpse of Ellen Fisher. The flight attendant stood near the galley, her expression a mix of triumph and uncertainty. She averted her gaze when Victoria passed. But the moment was telling. Victoria didn't stop, didn't falter. To do so would grant the moment more power than it deserved. She was escorted into a sterile room just beyond the gate, its harsh fluorescent lights making everything feel colder than it was. A table stood at the center, flanked by uniformed officers and airline security personnel. "Place the case on the table, ma'am," one of the officers instructed. Victoria complied, setting the briefcase down with care. She straightened, her hands clasped in front of her. "What exactly is the concern?" she asked, her tone polite but edged with quiet authority. "We received a report about your luggage," the officer replied, avoiding her gaze. "We need to inspect it." "A report?" Victoria asked, her voice calm but pointed. "From whom?" "That's not relevant right now," he said, his discomfort evident. "Please unlock the case." Victoria studied him for a moment, the silence heavy with unspoken meaning. Then, with a nod, she entered the code and released the latches. The lid lifted smoothly, revealing the contents inside. The room fell silent. Nestled within the briefcase, cradled in velvet, was the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Its golden surface gleamed under the unforgiving light, an emblem of a lifetime of service and sacrifice. Beside it lay the official certificate, bearing the signature of the President of the United States. One of the officers muttered under his breath, "Is this real?" "Yes," Victoria said evenly, breaking the silence. "It is." The lead officer stepped back, his face flushing with embarrassment. "Ma'am, we didn't realize." "No," Victoria interrupted, her voice sharp but controlled. "You didn't. You assumed. And because of that assumption, I've been humiliated in front of a plane full of people and delayed for no reason." The weight of her words hung in the air, undeniable and inescapable. Ellen Fisher was summoned into the room, her expression pale and her hands fidgeting. When she saw the contents of the briefcase, her eyes widened, and her lips parted in a weak attempt at explanation. "I thought," Ellen began, but the words died in her throat. "You thought wrong," Victoria said, her tone cutting but calm. "And now, here we are." The officers stumbled through apologies, their words fumbling and insincere. Victoria offered none in return. Instead, she closed the briefcase with a soft click and straightened her posture. She walked out of the room with her head held high, her dignity intact despite the ordeal. Back in the terminal, the noise of the crowd swirled around her, a sharp contrast to the sterile quiet of the interrogation room. A young black girl stood nearby with her mother, her wide eyes fixed on Victoria. In that gaze, there was something more than curiosity, admiration, perhaps, or a quiet hope. Victoria offered the girl a small nod and a soft smile before continuing on her way. Her steps were steady, her resolve unshaken. The ordeal had been unnecessary, unjust, but it was also a reminder of why she carried herself the way she did. For the ones who came after her, she would remain unbroken. She left the airport with her briefcase in hand, the medal inside a testament not just to her achievements but to the work that still lay ahead. The journey home was far from over, and neither was the fight. The ride from Dulles International Airport to Victoria Hayes Townhouse was cloaked in silence. Outside the car window, the city stretched and twisted, its lights casting soft reflections against the glass. Washington, D.C. was a city of contrasts, a place where power mingled with inequity, where the monuments to progress often overshadowed the work left undone. Victoria leaned back against the seat, her briefcase resting beside her. Though her body sat still, her mind churned, replaying the events of the evening with a quiet intensity. By the time she arrived home, the streets were hushed. The faint scent of autumn leaves carried on the cool night air. Her townhouse, modest but elegant, stood as a sanctuary against the chaos of the world outside. The door, painted a deep navy blue, seemed to welcome her back with the kind of warmth she rarely felt elsewhere. Inside, the familiar scent of lavender greeted her, mingling with the faint hum of the heating system. Victoria placed the briefcase on her desk and stood there for a moment, her hand resting lightly on its metallic surface. The indignity of the day lingered, not as anger but as a simmering frustration. A weariness she had carried for far too long. It was an exhaustion not from the journey itself but from the quiet battles that so often accompanied her steps. The whispers, the glances, the endless assumptions. They were small, almost imperceptible, but their weight was cumulative. She opened the briefcase, her eyes resting on the metal inside. Its golden surface gleamed under the soft glow of her desk lamp, a stark reminder of her achievements. But tonight, it felt less like a badge of honor and more like a target. Something that had drawn suspicion rather than respect. She closed the case with a quiet click and sat down, her hands resting on the smooth wood of the desk. The phone buzzed, breaking the silence. The screen lit up with the name Director James Preston, her former colleague and longtime mentor. She hesitated before answering, her voice steady despite the lingering fatigue. "James," she said simply. "Victoria," came his reply, warm but tinged with concern. "I just got off the phone with someone at the airport. Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she said, her words carefully measured. "It was an inconvenience, nothing more." "Inconvenience?" James's voice sharpened, his frustration evident. "They detained you over a locked briefcase containing the nation's highest civilian honor. That's more than an inconvenience, it's an embarrassment. For them, not for you." Victoria leaned back in her chair, her gaze drifting to the window. The city beyond was quiet, its streets bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. "It's not the first time," she said, her tone even, "and it won't be the last. I've learned to expect this." "Doesn't make it right," James muttered. After a pause, he added, "You've got every right to push back. Make this public, hold them accountable." Victoria smiled faintly, though there was no humor in it. "And what would that change? An apology? A promise to do better? We've heard those before." "It's not about the apology," James said. "It's about making them see. Making them understand what they've done." "They already know," she replied quietly. "That's the problem." After the call ended, Victoria sat in silence, her thoughts heavy. She wasn't angry. Anger was a flame she had learned to keep in check. What she felt was something deeper, more persistent. A quiet resolve that had grown stronger with every battle, every indignity. This wasn't just about her briefcase or her experience on the plane. It was about the systems that allowed such moments to persist, the unspoken biases that shaped every interaction. The next morning, the sunlight filtered through the curtains. Pale and tentative, Victoria rose early, her movements deliberate. She dressed simply, a navy blouse, slacks, and low heels before placing the briefcase back on her desk. She opened it one last time, her eyes lingering on the medal and the certificate beside it. This wasn't just a symbol of her achievements, it was a reminder of the battles she had fought and the battles yet to come. By mid-morning, she was seated in the sleek, glass-walled headquarters of Global Wings Airlines. The reception area was all polished surfaces and muted tones, designed to convey efficiency and professionalism. The receptionist, a young woman with a bright smile, greeted her with polite enthusiasm that shifted subtly when Victoria introduced herself. "Please have a seat," the woman said, her posture straightening. "Mr. Harrison will be with you shortly." 15 minutes later, Victoria was ushered into a spacious conference room, where Jonathan Harrison, the airline's chief operating officer, awaited her. The man was tall, impeccably dressed, and radiated a discomfort he tried to mask with contrition. "Ms. Hayes," he began, extending a hand, "thank you for coming. Let me start by saying how deeply sorry we are for what happened. This incident does not reflect our values as an airline. Victoria studied him for a moment before responding. Her tone calm but firm. "Your values may not reflect it," she said, "but your actions did. This wasn't an isolated incident, Mr. Harrison. It's part of a pattern, a culture that allows bias to go unchallenged." Harrison nodded, his expression tight. "We take allegations of bias very seriously. The flight attendant in question has already been placed on administrative leave." "That's not enough," Victoria interrupted, her voice steady. "This isn't about one person. It's about a system. What are you going to do to ensure this doesn't happen again?" Harrison hesitated, clearly unprepared for the directness of her question. Victoria slid a report across the table, her movements precise. "This outlines the steps you need to take," she said. "Mandatory bias training for all employees. Clear protocols for handling security concerns. Accountability measures for incidents like this. These aren't suggestions, Mr. Harrison. They're necessities." Harrison flipped through the report, his expression growing more serious with each page. "This is thorough," he said finally. "It has to be," Victoria replied, "because if it isn't addressed, I will ensure this reaches the people who can force your hand. And trust me, they'll be less patient than I am." As she left the meeting, Victoria felt a quiet sense of resolve. Change wouldn't come easily, she knew that. But she had planted a seed, and whether it grew or withered was now up to them. For her, the fight was far from over. But for the first time in days, she allowed herself to feel the smallest flicker of hope. The Capitol building loomed before Victoria Hayes, its iconic dome framed against a crisp blue sky. Its majesty was undeniable, but Victoria saw it as something else, a monument to contradictions. It was a symbol of both progress and resistance, of laws crafted to uplift yet enforced to exclude. She adjusted her blazer as she entered the building, the echo of her heels against the marble floor a reminder that every step she took was watched, measured, and judged. She was here not for personal vindication but to address a deeper fracture. Her experience on the plane had become a flashpoint in a larger national conversation, one that many had been eager to dismiss until now. The ripples from her humiliation had reached the desks of policymakers, culminating in a hearing on the systemic biases in air travel. The room buzzed with a tense energy as Victoria took her seat at the witness table. Senators filled their places on the dais, their faces a mosaic of curiosity, skepticism, and quiet indifference. The hearing room was packed, rows of spectators whispering in hushed tones, their voices a backdrop to the clicking of cameras and the rustle of papers. Victoria's presence, like the briefcase she carried, was a challenge, a silent assertion of her right to be here. Senator Robertson, an older man with a gravelly voice, called the meeting to order. "Today, we're here to examine the troubling allegations of bias and discrimination in air travel. Our first witness is Ms. Victoria Hayes." Victoria rose, her movements deliberate, and approached the microphone. The room stilled as she adjusted the microphone, her measured composure commanding attention. When she began to speak, her voice was steady, each word carrying the weight of her lived experience. "Good morning," she began. "My name is Victoria Hayes. I am here today not as the recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom, nor as a former diplomat. I am here as a woman who boarded a plane expecting dignity and respect, but instead was met with suspicion and humiliation." Her words cut through the air, silencing even the faintest whispers. She recounted the events of the flight, not with anger but with precision, her tone calm and unembellished. She described the glances, the whispers, the forced disembarkation, and the subsequent revelation of her briefcase's contents. Her account painted a vivid picture, not just of the incident itself but of the quieter, more insidious biases that had led to it. "This was not an isolated event," she continued, her gaze sweeping the room. "It was the culmination of countless moments, small and large, where I have been made to feel like an outsider in spaces I have rightfully earned. And I am not alone. For every story like mine, there are countless others that go untold." Senator Robertson leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "Ms. Hayes, do you believe this incident was a result of individual prejudice, or something more systemic?" Victoria met his gaze, her expression unwavering. "It is both, Senator. Individual biases do not exist in a vacuum. They are shaped and reinforced by the systems we create, systems that allow suspicion to replace understanding, and prejudice to masquerade as policy. The room remained silent for a beat, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Then came the questions. Some were thoughtful, probing the nuances of her experience. Others were defensive, their intent to undermine rather than understand. One senator, McAllister, shifted uncomfortably in his seat before speaking. Ms. Hayes, do you believe these protocols, however flawed they may be, are necessary for ensuring passenger safety? Isn't it better to be cautious, even if that caution is sometimes misplaced? Victoria tilted her head slightly, considering her response. Senator, I agree that safety is paramount. But caution that targets individuals based on their appearance is not safety, it's bias. And bias, left unchecked, undermines the very safety it claims to protect. McAllister didn't respond immediately, his discomfort evident. The room's atmosphere crackled with tension. The unspoken fault lines of privilege and prejudice laid bare. After the hearing adjourned, Victoria stepped into the corridor, her briefcase in hand. The reporters descended quickly, their voices overlapping as they fired questions in rapid succession. Ms. Hayes, do you believe this hearing will lead to meaningful change? Do you think the airline industry will respond? Do you see this as part of a larger movement? Victoria paused, her gaze steady as she addressed them. Change doesn't come quickly or easily, she said, but today, we took a step forward. Whether it leads to progress depends on all of us. The crowd murmured as she walked away, her steps measured, her expression calm. She had faced their questions with the same dignity she carried through every storm. But inside, she felt the weight of the battle ahead. The hearing was just one moment in a larger fight, and the forces of resistance were already gathering. Later that evening, Victoria met with Senator Amelia Brooks, a longtime advocate for civil rights who had championed the Passenger Dignity Act. The senator's office was cluttered but warm, its walls lined with photographs of protests, marches, and legislative victories. You were extraordinary today, Brooks said, pouring tea as they sat across from each other. You didn't just share your story, you made them see the bigger picture. Victoria smiled faintly, though her mind lingered on the resistance she had felt in the room. Some of them saw it, she said, but others are still clinging to their excuses. They always will, Brooks replied, but that's why we keep pushing. They don't get to decide when the fight ends. We do. Victoria nodded, her resolve hardening. She had stepped into this fight reluctantly. But now there was no turning back. The battle wasn't just for her dignity, it was for the dignity of everyone who had been silenced, dismissed, or judged. It was for a future where her story would no longer be necessary. As she left the senator's office, the city lights stretched before her, their glow softening the edges of the night. The path ahead was uncertain. But Victoria knew one thing with absolute clarity: she would keep walking it. One step, one battle, one victory at a time. The cold morning air wrapped itself around Victoria Hayes as she entered the glass-walled headquarters of Global Wings Airlines. A faint drizzle dotted the sidewalks, and the sky hung heavy with clouds ominous, unyielding. The irony was not lost on her. This meeting, this moment, felt much the same: heavy, necessary, and fraught with tension. Victoria had been invited to participate in the airline's inaugural anti-bias training session, a direct result of her ordeal and subsequent testimony. It wasn't the sweeping change she had envisioned, but it was a start. And like all beginnings, it carried the weight of resistance. The training room was stark and modern, its white walls lined with glossy posters bearing the company's slogan, "Flying Forward Together." It was a phrase that now felt both hollow and aspirational, depending on how one chose to interpret it. Victoria entered the room with the measured confidence she had cultivated over decades, her presence filling the space before she even spoke. The room was filled with airline staff, flight attendants, pilots, and ground crew, all seated at long tables. Their faces betrayed a spectrum of emotions: curiosity, skepticism, even hostility. Some leaned back in their chairs, arms crossed, their expressions daring anyone to challenge their deeply held beliefs. Others fidgeted nervously, unsure of what to expect. At the front of the room stood the trainer, Lydia Carter, a black woman with a sharp gaze and an unwavering voice. She introduced herself, outlining the goals of the session: to confront implicit bias, to foster understanding, and to create a more equitable environment for both staff and passengers. Victoria took a seat in the back, observing quietly as the session began. Lydia began with a simple exercise: asking participants to write down the first words that came to mind when they heard terms like pilot, passenger, or security risk. The responses were collected anonymously, then displayed on a screen at the front of the room. The results were stark. Words like professional, calm, and leader appeared next to pilot. But under security risk, the descriptors painted a different picture: angry, suspicious, other. Victoria noted the patterns immediately. The unspoken assumptions that shaped every interaction. Lydia didn't hesitate. This, she said, gesturing to the screen, is bias. It's not always overt, but it's there. It informs how we see people, how we treat them, and how we make decisions. A murmur rippled through the room. One flight attendant, a young man with a defensive posture, raised his hand. But sometimes those biases are based on real experiences, right? I mean, if you've seen certain behaviors over and over, isn't it natural to expect them? Lydia didn't flinch. It's natural to form patterns in your mind, she said, but it's dangerous to let those patterns become the lens through which you see everyone. Bias doesn't just affect the person being judged, it affects you. It narrows your vision, limits your ability to act with fairness and clarity. Victoria could see the words landing unevenly across the room. Some nodded in agreement, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The defensive man leaned back, arms still crossed, his expression unreadable. The session continued, delving into scenarios and role-playing exercises designed to challenge assumptions. Participants were asked to imagine themselves in situations where their biases might surface. A first-class passenger who didn't look the part. A colleague whose accent made them hard to understand. A security checkpoint where someone's appearance seemed to signal a threat. It was slow, uncomfortable work, and that discomfort was the point. Victoria remained silent, her presence unobtrusive yet undeniable. She watched as Lydia guided the group with skill and patience, drawing out moments of clarity amid the resistance. By the end of the session, there was a palpable shift in the room, not a full transformation, but a crack in the foundation of certainty. As the participants filed out, one figure lingered near the door. It was Ellen Fisher, the flight attendant who had reported Victoria on that fateful flight. Ellen's posture was hesitant, her hands fidgeting as she approached. "Ms. Hayes," Ellen began, her voice quiet, almost trembling. "Can I speak with you for a moment?" Victoria turned to face her fully, her expression unreadable but not unkind. "Of course." Ellen hesitated, searching for words. "I wanted to say I'm sorry. For what happened on the plane. For what I did. I made assumptions about you that weren't fair. And, this training today. It's made me realize just how much those assumptions shaped my actions." Victoria regarded her for a long moment, the silence heavy with unspoken meaning. Finally, she spoke, her tone even but firm. "Acknowledging your mistake is a start. But the real work is in what you do next. Apologies are words. Change is action." Ellen nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I know. And I'm trying. I promise I'm trying." Victoria offered her a small, measured nod. "That's all anyone can do. Keep trying." As Ellen walked away, Victoria allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. This, she realized, was the work, not grand speeches or sweeping reforms, but these small, human moments, the cracks in the wall, the seeds of change. Later that evening, Victoria returned to her townhouse. The rain had stopped, and the city lights reflected off the wet streets, casting a muted glow. She placed her briefcase on the desk and opened it, the metal inside gleaming faintly under the warm light. She thought about the day, about the room full of faces and the resistance etched into so many of them. Change was slow, uneven, and often frustrating, but it was happening. She could feel it, like the faintest tremor beneath her feet. Victoria closed the briefcase with a quiet click and sat back in her chair. The fight was far from over. But tonight, she allowed herself a rare moment of satisfaction. Progress wasn't always a tidal wave. Sometimes, it was a steady climb, one step at a time. And for now, that was enough. The capital was abuzz with an energy that Victoria Hayes could feel even from the street. The Passenger Dignity Act was up for a vote, and the corridors of power were filled with whispers, deals, and careful calculations. This was not unfamiliar terrain for Victoria. She had navigated these halls before, advocating for causes that mattered, always with the knowledge that progress came at a cost. As she entered the rotunda, she felt the weight of eyes upon her. She was no longer just Victoria Hayes, the woman with a medal in her briefcase. She had become a symbol, unwilling at first, but resolute now. The fight for this bill wasn't just about her, it was about everyone who had been judged, dismissed, or humiliated because of the color of their skin, the way they carried themselves, or the spaces they dared to enter. The hearing chamber was packed. Spectators filled every seat, and reporters lined the back wall, their cameras poised to capture every moment. The tension was thick, a quiet hum beneath the surface as lawmakers prepared to cast their votes. Victoria took her place in the gallery, her expression composed, though the stakes felt heavier than ever. As the roll call began, the room was silent except for the clerk's voice. One by one, names were called, and votes were cast. The tally appeared on the digital board at the front of the chamber, each number carrying the weight of months of work, resistance, and hope. Victoria's hands rested lightly in her lap, but her heart beat faster with every vote. She could feel the resistance in the air, the lawmakers who had dismissed her testimony, the lobbyists who had worked tirelessly to kill the bill, the quiet but unyielding force of a system designed to maintain the status quo. And yet, as the votes were counted, the tide began to turn. For every nay that lit up on the board, there were 2 ayes to counter it. The final tally appeared, 217 to 204. The bill had passed. The chamber erupted into applause. Though not all joined in, some faces were tight with frustration, others alight with victory. Victoria remained seated, her expression calm, though a faint smile tugged at the corners of her lips. She had learned long ago not to celebrate too quickly. This was a step forward, but the journey was far from over. Later that day, Victoria stood on the Capitol steps, the city stretching out before her. The air was crisp, the kind of autumn afternoon that hinted at change. Senator Amelia Brooks joined her, a broad smile on her face. "You did it," Brooks said, clapping her on the shoulder. "No," Victoria replied, her tone measured. "We did it, and now comes the hard part." Brooks nodded, her expression growing serious. "Implementation, enforcement, making sure this doesn't just become another law that looks good on paper." Victoria's gaze didn't waver. "Exactly. Passing the bill is just the beginning." The senator placed a hand on Victoria's arm. "Then it's a good thing we've got you to keep us accountable." Victoria didn't reply immediately. She looked out at the city, the weight of the moment settling over her. This was a victory, yes, but it was also a responsibility, a reminder that progress required vigilance. The weeks that followed were a blur of meetings, interviews, and workshops. Victoria became a central figure in the Civil Aviation Equity Commission, working to ensure that the principles of the Passenger Dignity Act were put into practice. Airlines began implementing mandatory bias training, creating protocols for handling security concerns, and establishing accountability measures for staff. But resistance remained. At a meeting with airline executives, one CEO dismissed the new regulations as burdensome and unnecessary. "Our company already prioritizes customer service," he said, leaning back in his chair. "These changes are overkill." Victoria met his gaze, her expression steady. "If that were true," she said, her voice calm but firm, "we wouldn't be here. These changes aren't burdens, they're opportunities. To lead, to build trust, to create an industry that values every passenger equally." Her words carried a weight that silenced the room. She wasn't asking for permission or pleading for change. She was demanding it. One evening, as Victoria returned to her townhouse, she found a letter waiting for her. It was from a young black woman who worked as a flight attendant. "Because of you," the letter read, "I feel like I belong in this industry for the first time. Thank you for making us visible." Victoria read the letter twice, her chest tightening. It was a small thing, but it reminded her why she fought. For every moment of resistance, there was a moment like this, a flicker of hope that made the struggle worthwhile. Months later, Victoria attended a surprise inspection at Global Wings Airlines. The training room was filled with flight attendants and pilots, all engaged in scenarios designed to challenge their assumptions. Among them was Ellen Fisher. After the session, Ellen approached Victoria, her hands clasped in front of her. "Ms. Hayes," she said, her voice quiet but steady, "I wanted to thank you for everything. I know I still have work to do, but I'm trying." Victoria offered her a small, measured nod. "That's all anyone can do. Keep trying." As Victoria left the building, she paused to look back. The sleek, modern structure that had once felt like a fortress now seemed like a symbol of what was possible. Change wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick, but it was happening. She walked to her car, her steps steady, her resolve unshaken. The fight against bias wasn't about grand gestures or sweeping victories. It was about the quiet moments, the small shifts in perspective, the steady climb toward equity. And for Victoria Hayes, the climb was far from over. But for the first time, she allowed herself to feel the weight of hope.